The winter of 1876 brought the harshest blizzard the Dakota Territory had seen in decades. For 28-year-old Sarah Thornwood, the howling winds outside her isolated cabin were nothing compared to the storm raging in her heart. 6 months earlier, she had buried her husband after a logging accident, left her alone on the edge of the frontier. The nearest settlement was 30 miles away, and as the snow piled higher, Sarah knew she wouldn't see another soul until spring. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Or so she thought, when a bleeding man collapsed on her doorstep. In the dead of night, Sarah faced a choice that would forever alter her destiny. She didn't know he was an Army scout. She didn't know his Lakota brothers considered him a traitor, and she certainly didn't know that by saving his life, she was placing her own in grave danger. By the time the sun rose 3 weeks later, over 40 Lakota warriors would surround her small cabin. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable untold stories of the American frontier. Sarah Thornwood pulled her woolen shawl tight against the biting cold as she stoked the dying embers in her stone fireplace. Outside, the February wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the wooden shutters she had fastened tightly before nightfall. 3 months had passed since she'd spoken to another human being, the traveling peddler who'd promised to return before Christmas, but never did. Perhaps he'd been wise enough to avoid this God-forsaken stretch of the Dakota Territory during the worst winter anyone could remember. Her husband, Thomas, would have known how to properly seal the cabin against such cold. He would have patched that spot in the northwest corner where snow somehow found its way inside, forming tiny white piles on the rough-hewn floor. But Thomas was gone, his body resting beneath 6 feet of frozen earth behind the cabin, marked by a simple wooden cross she had fashioned herself. Just until spring, Sarah whispered to the empty room, repeating the mantra that had sustained her through the endless nights. When the thaw came, she would sell what little they had and return east to her sister's home in Pennsylvania. She had made her peace with that decision, though it felt like surrendering Thomas's dream of building a life on this wild frontier. The clock on the mantel, her most precious possession brought all the way from Boston, chimed 11 times. Sarah added another log to the fire and prepared for bed, setting her father's old Army revolver on the small table beside her. She never used to sleep with it nearby when Thomas was alive. Now she couldn't sleep without it. The sound came just as she was drifting off, a dull thud against the door, so faint she thought she might have dreamed it. Sarah sat upright, straining to hear over the moaning wind. Then it came again, more insistent this time. Not a knock exactly, but something heavy hitting the wood. Sarah's hands trembled as she lit the oil lamp and reached for the revolver. No, Traveler would be out on a night like this. It could be a desperate animal, perhaps a wolf driven mad by hunger. Or worse, a drifter who had spotted the smoke from her chimney and decided a widow's cabin was easy pickings. "Who's there?" she called, out, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm armed, and I won't hesitate to shoot." No response came except the relentless wind. Sarah approached the door cautiously, revolver gripped tightly. She hesitated, then slid open the small viewing hatch Thomas had built into the door. Through the narrow opening, she could see nothing at first, just darkness and swirling snow. Then her lamp illuminated something on her porch. Not an animal, a man. He lay face down, motionless, a dark stain spreading beneath him that Sarah knew instinctively wasn't melted snow. Blood. Every instinct told her to bar the door and wait until morning. A bleeding stranger was nothing but danger. But something else, perhaps the same stubborn sense of decency that had led her to follow Thomas to this wilderness, wouldn't allow her to leave a dying man in the cold. With trembling fingers, Sarah unbolted the door, keeping the revolver ready. The wind nearly knocked her backward as she pushed the door open against the gathering snow. The man didn't move as she nudged him with her foot. Cautiously, she knelt down and rolled him over. His face was young, younger than she expected, though, lined with exhaustion and pain. His skin was the deep copper of the indigenous tribes, his long black hair frozen in matted clumps around a handsome face contorted in agony. He wore a strange combination of clothing, buckskin leggings like those worn by the native peoples, but also a tattered blue cavalry jacket. Blood seeped from a wound in his side, staining the military wool a deep crimson. Sarah made her decision. In an instant, she couldn't get him inside by herself, not without dragging him and potentially worsening his injuries. Instead, she ran to the barn and returned with the flat wooden sled Thomas had built for hauling supplies. With extraordinary effort, she managed to roll the unconscious man onto it and pull him into her cabin, leaving a trail of blood on the fresh snow. Once inside, Sarah bolted the door and leaned against it, breathing heavily, the reality of what she'd done settling upon her. She had just brought a strange, wounded man into her home, a man who, from his appearance, walked in two worlds, neither of which had shown much kindness to settlers like her. "Lord help me," she whispered, then set to work. Sarah had assisted the doctor back in Boston often enough to know the basics of treating wounds. She cut away the frozen, blood-soaked clothing to reveal a deep gash across the man's ribs. It wasn't a slash made by a blade, but rather a bullet wound that had torn through flesh and muscle. By some miracle, it appeared to have missed anything vital, though the man had lost considerable blood. She cleaned and dressed the wound with supplies from her carefully maintained medicine box, then covered him with blankets near the fire. Throughout it all, he remained unconscious, occasionally mumbling words in a language she didn't understand. As dawn approached, Sarah sat in her rocking chair, revolver still within reach, watching the stranger's chest rise and fall with labored breaths. She had done what she could. Whether he lived or died was now in God's hands. The man's fever broke on the third day. Sarah had barely slept, catching only moments of rest in her chair, always keeping the revolver close. She had changed his bandages twice daily, spooned broth between his cracked lips, and prayed more than she had in the months since Thomas died. When his eyes finally opened, dark and intense, Sarah was washing dishes at the small wooden table. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely audible. Sarah approached cautiously, ladling water from a bucket into a tin cup. She held it to his lips, supporting his head as he drank greedily. "Slowly," she cautioned. "You'll make yourself sick," he finished, and lay back, studying her face with a guarded expression. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah returned his stare. "I couldn't leave you to die in the snow." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Many would have." "I'm not many," she replied, refreshing, the cool cloth on his forehead. "I'm Sarah Thornwood." He hesitated before answering. Matthew Blackwood." Sarah nodded, noting how he offered no explanation for his strange attire or how he came to be wounded and collapsed on her doorstep. She didn't press. The answers would come in time or they wouldn't. For now it was enough that he would live. "You've been shot, Mr. Blackwood. The bullet tore through your side but didn't hit anything vital." "You're lucky," Matthew grimaced. "Luck had nothing to do with it. Their aim was off because of the storm." "There?" Sarah asked, her suspicion returning. "Who shot you?" Again, he hesitated. "People who believe I've betrayed them." "Have you?" His eyes met hers unflinching. "That depends on who you ask." Sarah returned to her dishes, unsettled by his cryptic response. "Rest now. We can talk more when you're stronger." Over the next few days, as Matthew regained his strength, Sarah learned his story in pieces, offered reluctantly between long silences. His mother had been Lakota, his father a white cavalry officer who had actually respected and tried to understand the native ways. Matthew had grown up between two worlds, never fully accepted by either. When the tensions between settlers and the Lakota escalated, Matthew had made a choice to serve as a scout for the army, believing he could help prevent bloodshed by facilitating understanding between the two sides. Instead, he had become distrusted by both, seen as a traitor by his mother's people, and never fully trusted by the military men he guided. 3 nights ago, he explained, as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew, I learned of a planned raid on a Lakota winter camp, women and children mostly, with only a few warriors present. The commander wouldn't listen to reason, insisted they were harboring hostiles. I couldn't be part of it. Sarah watched him carefully. So you warned them? Matthew nodded slowly. I slipped away and rode hard through the blizzard. Got to the camp in time for them to move to safety. But some of them shot you anyway, Sarah said, trying to understand. My own cousin, Matthew said, a look of pain crossing his face that had nothing to do with his physical wound. To him, I've been dead since the day I put on this uniform. He fingered the torn cavalry jacket Sarah had mended and washed for him. And now the army will consider you a deserter, Sarah concluded. You're caught between both sides. Matthew's smile held no humor. Story of my life, Mrs. Thornwood. Sarah, she corrected him. Out here, formalities seem rather pointless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah, he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her cheeks warm, despite the bitter cold outside. As February gave way to March, Matthew's strength returned rapidly. He insisted on earning his keep, chopping wood when Sarah would allow it, repairing the leaky corner of the cabin roof, and even successfully hunting game when their supplies ran low. Despite her initial wariness, Sarah found herself enjoying his company, the first real conversation she'd had since Thomas died. At night, they would sit by the fire, and Matthew would tell her stories of his childhood, moving between the Lakota camps and the military outposts, learning 2 sets of traditions, speaking 2 languages. In turn, Sarah shared memories of Boston, her journey west with Thomas, and their dreams for the homestead that now seemed so distant. He was a good man, your husband, Matthew observed one evening, as Sarah showed him the small wooden figurines Thomas had carved during the previous winter. He was, Sarah agreed, surprised to find she could speak of Thomas without the sharp pain that had accompanied his memory for so long. Stubborn as a mule and completely impractical at times, but good to his core. He built this place solid, Matthew said, looking around approvingly. Knew what he was doing. Except for that leaky corner, Sarah smiled. Even the best builders can miss something, Matthew replied. At least he picked good land, the rise. Keeps the worst floods away, the tree line blocks the north wind, and there's game aplenty in those woods. Sarah looked at him curiously. You sound like you're trying to sell me on staying. Matthew's expression grew serious. A place like this, it's worth fighting for. There's nothing for me here, Sarah said softly, looking away. Just memories. Memories are the foundation, Matthew replied. But you can build something new on them. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Sarah busied herself with mending, and Matthew returned to carving a piece of wood he had been working on for days, refusing to show her until it was finished. Later that night, as Sarah lay in her bed and Matthew slept on his pallet by the fire, she found herself wondering what it might be like to truly start anew here. Not alone, but with someone who understood both the beauty and the dangers of this harsh land. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The peace of their routine was shattered at dawn on the 15th day after Matthew's arrival. Sarah had risen early as usual to stoke the fire and prepare breakfast when she noticed Matthew standing rigidly by the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by the tension in his posture. "Riders," he said grimly, "many of them, moving slowly through the trees." Sarah joined him at the window, her heart hammering in her chest. In the dim, early light, she could make out mounted figures emerging from the forest edge, their breath visible in the cold morning air. "Army?" she asked hopefully, though she already knew the answer from Matthew's expression. "Lakota," he confirmed. 40, maybe more. War party. How did they find you in this wilderness?" Sarah whispered, fear clawing at her throat. Matthew's expression was grim. "They didn't need to find me. They were following the army patrol that's been tracking me. The soldiers are probably less than half a day behind." "We're caught between them," Sarah realized, her mind racing. All the progress she'd made in planning her journey east, all the careful saving and preparation over the lonely winter months, none of it mattered now as hostile forces converged on her small cabin. Matthew gripped her shoulders, his dark eyes intense. "Listen to me, Sarah. When they approach, I want you to take the revolver and show yourself on the porch. Tell them I forced my way in here, that you had no choice but to treat my wounds. Tell them you're my captive." "That's not true," she protested. "It doesn't matter. It might save your life." His hands tightened slightly. "The man leading them is Standing Bear. He's respected, a man of honor, but he's also my cousin's father, and he believes I've betrayed our people. If he thinks you helped me willingly—" He didn't need to finish the thought. Sarah understood the implication all too well. "And what about you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Matthew's smile was resigned. "I made my choice weeks ago when I warned the camp. I always knew the price." Sarah pulled away from him, anger replacing her fear. "No, I didn't nurse you back to health, just so you could throw your life away, Sarah. There has to be another way," she insisted. "We can explain, reason with them." Matthew shook his head. "You don't understand. There are warriors out there who've lost family to the blue coats. They don't see a man when they look at me. They see a symbol of everything they hate." "Then I'll make them see," Sarah said with sudden determination. "I'll make them understand." Before Matthew could stop her, Sarah moved to the cabinet where she kept her most precious possessions. From a small wooden box, she removed a simple item, a beaded bracelet with a distinctive pattern of blue and white. Matthew stared at it in shock. "Where did you get that?" "A woman gave it to me," Sarah explained, tying it around her wrist. 2 summers ago, a Lakota family came through our land. A mother, father, and their sick child. Thomas and I helped them. The woman spoke some English. She said this would mark me as a friend." "Flying Bird's family," Matthew whispered in recognition. "The pattern is her family's mark." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. "Is she out there? With the war party?" "No, but her brother is. Grey Wolf. He rides with Standing Bear." For the first time since spotting the riders, a hint of hope appeared in Matthew's expression. It might be enough to get them to listen, but Sarah, these are proud men. They won't just take our word. Sarah moved to the door with a conviction that surprised even her. "Then we'll give them more than words." The riders had formed a wide semicircle around the cabin, just beyond rifle range. Their faces were painted for war, their expressions grim and determined. In the center, on a magnificent spotted horse, sat an older man with deep lines etched into his weathered face and grey streaks in his long braided hair. Standing Bear. Sarah stepped onto the porch, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. Beside her, Matthew stood straight despite his still-healing wound, his jaw set in defiance or resignation, perhaps both. As dawn broke over the Dakota plains, Sarah Thornwood faced 40 Lakota warriors with nothing but a beaded bracelet and a desperate hope that somewhere in this harsh land, compassion might still matter more than vengeance. Standing Bear raised his hand, and the warriors behind him grew still, watching silently as the white woman and the man they had come to execute stood side by side on the cabin porch. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring as two worlds collided on a frontier that had already seen too much bloodshed. What happened next would either add to that violent legacy or perhaps, just perhaps, begin to heal it. The morning air was sharp with frost as Sarah stood beside Matthew, acutely aware of the mounted warriors watching their every move. She held her arm up, letting the beaded bracelet catch the first rays of sunlight. "I am friend to Flying Bird and her family," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. "2 summers past, they sheltered here when their child was sick with fever." A murmur passed through the warriors. A tall man with a hawk feather in his hair urged his horse forward, stopping several yards from the cabin. His eyes narrowed as he studied the bracelet. "I am Grey Wolf, brother to Flying Bird," he announced in careful English. "How does a white woman come to wear our family's pattern?" Sarah stepped forward, ignoring Matthew's attempt to hold her back. "Your sister gave it to me after my husband and I helped save her son. The boy had lung sickness. We shared our medicine, our food, our home." Grey Wolf's expression remained impassive, but his eyes moved to Matthew. "And this one? The scout who walks with our enemies?" "He collapsed wounded at my door," Sarah explained. "I could not let him die, just as I could not turn away your sister's family." Standing Bear now approached, his spotted horse moving gracefully across the frozen ground. Unlike Grey Wolf, he did not speak English, instead addressing Matthew in Lakota. Matthew responded in the same language, the words flowing naturally in what became an intense exchange. Sarah could only watch, trying to read their expressions as the two men spoke. Standing Bear's face remained stern, occasionally glancing at Sarah with unmistakable suspicion. Matthew spoke with growing urgency, occasionally gesturing toward the cabin, toward Sarah, toward the distant hills. Finally, Standing Bear raised his hand, silencing Matthew. He turned to Grey Wolf and spoke briefly in Lakota. Grey Wolf nodded and addressed Sarah. "Our chief wishes to know why you help this man who serves those who kill our people." Sarah felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes upon her. Her answer could mean life or death for both of them. She thought of the comfortable Boston home she had left behind, of Thomas's dreams for this frontier land, of Matthew's stories about living between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. "I help him because he tried to prevent bloodshed," she said firmly. "He risked his life to warn your winter camp about the army's raid. That is why he was shot, by his own cousin." Grey Wolf translated her words. Standing Bear's weathered face revealed nothing as he listened, but his eyes, sharp as an eagle's, studied Sarah intently. He spoke again, his voice deep and resonant, even in a language Sarah couldn't understand. "The chief says this may be true, or may be lies," Grey Wolf translated. "Words are like smoke. They drift away. He wants proof." Matthew stepped forward, carefully unwrapping the bandage from his side to reveal the healing wound. "Tell your father," he said to Grey Wolf in English, ensuring Sarah could understand, "that Running Elk's bullet found me as I rode from the army camp. Tell him I still have the maps showing where the soldiers plan to attack. They are hidden beneath the floorboards." Sarah looked at Matthew in surprise. She had no knowledge of any maps in her cabin. Matthew gave her a quick glance that told her to remain silent, Grey Wolf translated, and Standing Bear's expression changed subtly. He barked an order, and 2 warriors dismounted, approaching the cabin with weapons ready. "They will look for these maps," Grey Wolf explained. Sarah reluctantly moved aside, allowing the warriors to enter her home. Matthew directed them in Lakota to a specific floorboard near the fireplace. One Sarah had never noticed was loose, The warriors returned moments later with a small oilskin packet, which they brought directly to Standing Bear. The chief examined the contents, detailed maps of the territory, with military notations and a letter written in a precise hand. Though Sarah couldn't see the documents clearly, the official army insignia was unmistakable. Standing Bear's expression darkened as he examined them. "The soldier chief writes of a surprise attack on our people," Grey Wolf translated as Standing Bear spoke. "He mentions this one," he nodded toward Matthew, "as knowing the hidden paths to our winter camps." "But Matthew didn't lead them there," Sarah interjected. "He warned your people instead." Standing Bear studied Matthew for a long moment before speaking again, his words measured and deliberate. "Our chief says that Black Crow, the one you call Matthew, has blood of our people in his veins, but wears the blue coat of our enemies." Grey Wolf translated, "A man cannot drink from two rivers at once. Without drowning, he must choose his path." Matthew nodded solemnly. "I have chosen. I turned away from the path of war against your people. I will not guide soldiers to Lakota camps again." When Grey Wolf translated these words, murmurs spread through the assembled warriors. Standing Bear raised his hand for silence, then spoke directly to Matthew in Lakota. The exchange that followed was intense, with Matthew's expression growing. Increasingly troubled. "What is it?" Sarah asked when there was a pause. "What does he want?" Matthew turned to her, conflict evident in his eyes. "He believes me about warning the camp, but he says that's not enough. The army patrol tracking me will be here by nightfall. Standing Bear wants me to help them set an ambush for the soldiers." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning frost. "That would make you a traitor to the army, in truth." "Yes." "How many soldiers in the patrol?" 8, maybe 10. Matthew's jaw tightened. "Men I've ridden with for 2 years. Sarah touched his arm gently. "What will you do?" Before Matthew could answer, a young warrior rode up to Standing Bear, speaking rapidly in Lakota. The chief's expression hardened as he listened. "Dust on the southern ridge," Grey Wolf explained to Sarah. "The soldiers come sooner than expected." Standing Bear issued a series of commands, and the warriors began to move with practiced efficiency, some taking positions behind trees and rocks, others disappearing into the surrounding forest. Grey Wolf remained with Standing Bear, both watching Matthew intently. "They're preparing for battle," Matthew said grimly. "Sarah, go inside the cabin. Whatever happens, stay there." "No," Sarah said firmly. "This is my home. I have a say in what happens here." Matthew looked like he wanted to argue, but was interrupted by Standing Bear, who addressed him again in Lakota. Whatever he said made Matthew stiffen. "He says I must prove my loyalty now," Matthew translated, "by standing with them against the soldiers or by dying with them." Sarah's mind raced. The situation was spiraling toward bloodshed that would destroy everything: her home, Matthew's life, any chance of peace. There had to be another way. "Tell him I wish to speak," she said suddenly. When Matthew hesitated, she added, "Please, tell him." Matthew spoke to Standing Bear, who looked surprised but nodded his permission. Sarah stepped forward, addressing the chief directly, even though she knew he wouldn't understand her words. Grey Wolf would translate, but she wanted Standing Bear to see her face, her conviction. "Chief Standing Bear, I am just one woman, but this is my land. I have lived through a winter alone after burying my husband. I have survived by my own strength and by helping others who needed shelter, your family members among them." She held up the bracelet again. "I don't want blood spilled here. Not Lakota blood. Not soldier blood. Not today." As Grey Wolf translated, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "The soldiers are coming for Matthew, believing he has deserted. They don't know about your warriors. If they ride into an ambush, many will die on both sides, and the army will send hundreds more. Standing Bear listened impassively as Grey Wolf translated. When Sarah finished, the chief responded with a question, which Grey Wolf relayed. "What would you have us do, woman? Ride away and leave this traitor to his fate?" "No," Sarah replied. "I have another way." She quickly outlined her plan, one born of desperation, but with a slim chance of preventing bloodshed. Matthew would appear to be her prisoner, tied up on the porch where the approaching soldiers could clearly see him. Sarah would claim she had captured him after he collapsed from his wound. The Lakota warriors would remain hidden in the forest, ready to attack only if the soldiers threatened Sarah or refused her terms. "What terms?" Grey Wolf asked when he had translated the rest. "That Matthew be allowed to stand trial properly at Fort Lincoln, rather than being executed on the spot as a deserter," Sarah explained. "And that this land, my land, be recognized as neutral ground, where neither soldier nor warrior brings weapons or threatens peace." It was an audacious proposal from a frontier widow with no power beyond the walls of her small cabin. Standing Bear clearly thought so too, for he laughed, a short, gruff sound, when Grey Wolf translated her words. Yet something in her demeanor must have impressed him, for after conferring briefly with several older warriors, he nodded slowly and spoke again. "The chief says your plan has the feather of chance, not the rock of certainty," Grey Wolf translated. "But he respects your courage and your desire to avoid bloodshed. He will withdraw his warriors to the forest's edge and watch. If the blue coats honor your words, there will be no battle today. If they break faith—" He made a slashing gesture across his throat that required no translation. Sarah exhaled slowly, relief mingling with fear. "Thank you." Standing Bear spoke again, this time directly to Matthew. The young scout listened, then nodded gravely. "What did he say?" Sarah asked when Standing Bear had ridden away to position his warriors. "He said that whatever happens today, I have made my final choice. If I live, I can never again walk the middle path. I am either Lakota and dead to the white world, or I am white and dead to the Lakota." Matthew's voice was hollow. He said a man cannot serve two masters any more than water can flow uphill. Sarah touched his arm gently. "Perhaps not. But a man can be true to himself. That's what you're doing." Matthew studied her face. "You risk everything for a man you barely know." "I know enough," Sarah replied simply. "Now let's make this convincing." Within minutes, Matthew was seated on the porch, his hands loosely bound before him, tight enough to appear secure to distant observers, but loose enough that he could free himself if necessary. Sarah had torn her dress and mussed her hair to support her story of struggling with an intruder. The Lakota warriors had melted into the forest with remarkable speed, leaving the clearing empty save for Sarah and Matthew. To a casual observer, it would appear to be just a cabin with a captured man and the woman who had subdued him. They didn't have long to wait. Within half an hour, the jingle of equipment and the thud of hooves announced the arrival of the army. Patrol. 8 men in blue uniforms rode into view, led by a lieutenant with a hard face and cold eyes. They approached cautiously, rifles ready. "That's Lieutenant Wade," Matthew said quietly. "Ambitious man, not one for mercy or understanding." Sarah squeezed his shoulder once before stepping forward, her father's revolver visible in her hand. "That's far enough!" she called out when the riders were within earshot. The patrol halted, clearly surprised to see a woman. The lieutenant raised his hand in greeting. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant James Wade, United States Army. We're tracking a deserter, a half-breed scout who betrayed his post." "You mean this man?" Sarah gestured toward Matthew with her revolver. "He collapsed at my door 2 weeks ago, bleeding and delirious. When he healed enough to try to escape, I subdued him." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You subdued him? A woman alone?" Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm a Boston doctor's daughter, Lieutenant. I know how to mix laudanum into broth, and I know how to use this." She lifted the revolver slightly. My father served at Gettysburg. He taught me well." A hint of respect flickered across Wade's face. "Then we're in your debt, Mom. We'll take the prisoner and trouble you no further." "Not so fast," Sarah said, maintaining her position between the soldiers and Matthew. "This man is wounded and requires medical attention before transport, and I want your word he'll receive a proper trial at Fort Lincoln, not frontier justice." Wade's jaw tightened. "Mom, with respect, this isn't your concern. The man's a deserter and a traitor. He warned hostiles about a military operation." "Then prove it at trial," Sarah insisted. "Unless the United States Army no longer believes in the rule of law." The lieutenant dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "You seem mighty concerned about the welfare of a man who broke into your home." "I'm concerned about justice, Lieutenant. My husband didn't die in the war for us to abandon our principles when they're inconvenient." Wade glanced at his men, then back at Sarah. Something in her bearing, or perhaps the knowledge that she was clearly not intimidated by their uniforms or weapons, seemed to give him pause. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll take him to Fort Lincoln for trial, you have my word." Sarah nodded, relief washing through her, though she kept her expression stern. "One more thing, Lieutenant. This land is my homestead. I want your assurance that it will be respected as neutral territory. No military operations, no pursuit of natives across my property." Wade frowned. "That's not within my authority to grant." "Ma'am, then send someone with the authority," Sarah countered. "Until then, the prisoner stays with me." The standoff stretched for several tense moments. Sarah was acutely aware of the Lakota warriors watching from the forest edges, of Matthew behind her, of the soldiers' hands never straying far from their weapons. Finally, Wade nodded stiffly. "I'll have papers drawn up and sent from the fort. But the prisoner comes with us now." Sarah pretended to consider this. "Agreed, but I'll need documentation of your promise regarding his trial, written and signed." The lieutenant's irritation was evident, but he gestured to one of his men, who produced a small writing kit. Wade scratched out a brief note guaranteeing Matthew's transport to Fort Lincoln for proper military proceedings, signing it with obvious reluctance. As two soldiers moved to take custody of Matthew, Sarah leaned close to him, whispering, "This isn't over. I'll come to the fort." Matthew's eyes met hers, filled with a complex mixture of emotions. "You've done enough, Sarah Thornwood, more than anyone has ever done for me." "Not nearly enough," she replied softly, then stepped back as the soldiers cut his bonds and replaced them with their own, much tighter restraints. As the patrol prepared to depart with their prisoner, Lieutenant Wade approached Sarah once more. "You're alone out here, Ma'am. It's not safe, especially with hostiles in the area. Perhaps you should consider returning east." Sarah looked past him to the edge of her property, where the morning sun illuminated the simple wooden cross marking, Thomas's grave. Then her gaze drifted to the forest, where she knew Standing Bear and his warriors were watching, and finally to Matthew, seated rigidly on a horse between two armed guards. "This is my home, Lieutenant," she said with quiet certainty. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Wade tipped his hat reluctantly. "As you wish, ma'am." Sarah watched them ride away, Matthew's straight-backed figure gradually diminishing in the distance. Only when they had disappeared over the ridge did Standing Bear and Grey Wolf emerge from the forest, approaching her with newfound respect. In their eyes, "Your words were strong," Grey Wolf said. "Your heart is strong." Standing Bear spoke at length, his gaze fixed on Sarah's face. "Our chief says you have honored the gift of his sister's family," Grey Wolf translated. "He says the ground of your home will be respected by his people. No Lakota will bring harm to this place or to you." Sarah inclined her head. "Thank your chief for me. Tell him I will continue to honor the friendship between us." As Standing Bear prepared to depart with his warriors, he said one final thing, which Grey Wolf translated with a hint of surprise in his voice. "He says you may have saved Black Crow today, but his path remains dangerous. A man of two worlds must forever watch both sides of the river. Tell him I understand, Sarah replied, and tell him I intend to watch the river as well. The Lakota departed as silently as they had appeared, leaving Sarah alone once more on her porch. But the crushing solitude she had felt throughout the winter was gone. In its place was purpose, a newfound strength, and a determination that surprised even her. She turned toward her cabin, mind already racing with plans. Fort Lincoln was a 3-day ride. She would need supplies, her best clothes, and Thomas's old military discharge papers. Lieutenant Wade had given his word about Matthew's trial, but Sarah Thornwood had not survived a frontier winter by being naive. As she packed her saddlebags, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror Thomas had given her on their first anniversary. The woman who looked back at her was no longer the grief-stricken widow of 3 months ago. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Just until spring, she whispered to herself, repeating her old mantra with a new meaning entirely. The snow was already beginning to melt. By the time the prairie bloomed with wildflowers, Sarah intended to have secured both Matthew's freedom and the promise of her land as neutral ground, a small island of peace in a territory torn by conflict. Sarah Thornwood had come to the Dakota Territory as a settler's wife. Now she would forge her own path as a woman of the frontier, building something new on the foundation of everything she had lost and found. Behind her, through the open cabin, the morning sun illuminated the spot where a wounded man had collapsed 15 days earlier, changing both their lives forever. Outside, the tracks of 40 Lakota warriors and 8 Army soldiers crisscrossed her property, a visible reminder of the delicate position she now occupied between two colliding worlds. Sarah closed her saddlebags with a decisive snap. The journey ahead would not be easy, but frontier life had taught her that nothing worthwhile ever was. With one final glance at Thomas's grave, she mounted her horse and pointed it toward Fort Lincoln, leaving behind the safety of her cabin to fight for a future she had only just begun to imagine. A future where a man of two worlds might find peace, where a woman alone might forge strength from loss, where a small homestead on contested ground might become something more, a place of beginning rather than ending. Sarah rode forward, head held high, as the Dakota sun climbed into a sky as vast and full of possibility as the frontier itself. The journey to Fort Lincoln tested every ounce of Sarah's resolve. Spring thaws had turned the prairie trails to mud, slowing her progress and forcing her to camp an extra night in the open. A late-season storm drenched her to the bone on the second day, and she'd encountered a group of suspicious trappers who had only moved on after she'd displayed both her revolver and her unwavering glare. By the time the fort's wooden palisade appeared on the horizon late on the 4th day, Sarah was exhausted, filthy, and more determined than ever. The American flag snapped in the wind above the guard tower, a reminder of the authority she was about to challenge. The sentry at the gate regarded her with surprise. Women at frontier forts were rare enough. A lone woman who had clearly ridden for days across difficult terrain was rarer still. "State your business, ma'am," the young soldier said, eyeing her mud-splattered clothes and wind-burned face. "My name is Sarah Thornwood. I've come regarding the scout brought in by Lieutenant Wade's patrol, Matthew Blackwood." She sat straight, in her saddle despite her fatigue. "I need to speak with the commanding officer." The sentry hesitated. "Ma'am, civilians don't typically—" "The prisoner was captured on my property," Sarah interrupted. "I have Lieutenant Wade's written guarantee of a proper trial." She produced the crumpled paper from her saddlebag. "Now, will you announce me, or shall I find my own way to headquarters?" Something in her tone, the steel beneath the politeness, made the young man reconsider. He called for another soldier to escort her, and within minutes Sarah found herself dismounting before the commander's quarters, aware of curious eyes watching from all directions. Colonel William Prescott was not what Sarah had expected. Unlike the hard-faced Lieutenant Wade, the fort's commander was an older man with intelligent eyes and a thoughtful demeanor. He invited her to sit in his office, ordering coffee for them both, before addressing her unexpected arrival. "Mrs. Thornwood," he said, examining Wade's note, "this is most irregular. Lieutenant Wade had no authority to make such promises regarding your land." "Perhaps not," Sarah conceded, "but he had authority to guarantee a proper trial for his prisoner. Did he not?" Prescott's expression tightened. "The scout deserted his post and betrayed military operations to hostiles. That's treason in wartime." "Is this wartime, Colonel?" Sarah challenged. "Has Congress declared war on the Lakota Nation, or are we still operating under the treaty signed at Fort Laramie?" The Colonel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're remarkably well-informed for a frontier widow, Mrs. Thornwood. My father was a military physician. I grew up on army posts." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Matthew Blackwood prevented a massacre of women and children. That's not treason, it's humanity." "You seem quite certain of his motives." "I nursed him back from the brink of death. We had many long conversations." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Colonel, Matthew knows these lands better than any of your men. He speaks the Lakota language fluently. He has connections to both worlds. That makes him valuable, not expendable." Prescott sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. "What exactly are you proposing, Mrs. Thornwood?" "A fair military trial, as Lieutenant Wade promised. And if Matthew is cleared, or after he serves an appropriate sentence, I would employ him on my homestead." She kept her voice even, professional. "My husband died this winter. I need help with the land, and Matthew needs a place where he can use his knowledge of both worlds constructively." The Colonel set down his cup. "You're proposing to rehabilitate a deserter." "I'm proposing to salvage a valuable asset," Sarah countered. "One who could help establish better relations between settlers and natives in our region." For several long moments, Prescott said nothing, merely studying her face as if searching for weakness or deception. Finding neither, he finally nodded. "Very well, Mrs. Thornwood. The scout will receive a proper hearing tomorrow morning. You may attend if you wish." He rose, indicating their meeting was concluded. "Quartermaster will arrange quarters for you tonight. I suggest you rest. You look as though you've had a difficult journey." "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah said, standing as well. "One more thing. I'd like to see Matthew." Prescott's expression hardened. "That's not possible. He's in the stockade, and regulations—" "Colonel," Sarah interrupted gently, "I've ridden 4 days through spring mud and storms. I've faced armed trappers and slept on bare ground. All to ensure justice for a man I believe has been gravely misunderstood. Surely regulations can bend enough to allow me 5 minutes." The ghost of a smile touched Prescott's lips. "You are indeed persistent, Mrs. Thornwood." He called for an orderly. "Escort Mrs. Thornwood to the stockade. She has 5 minutes with the scout prisoner, no longer." Sarah followed the young soldier across the busy fort, ignoring the curious stares from troopers and the few officers' wives visible on porches. The stockade was a low stone building with narrow windows set high in the walls, more a holding facility than a proper prison, but forbidding nonetheless. The guard reluctantly unlocked the heavy door to reveal a small, dim cell. Matthew sat on a narrow cot, his hands manacled, his face bruised. He looked up in disbelief as Sarah entered. "You actually came," he said, rising unsteadily to his feet. Sarah wanted to embrace him, but was acutely aware of the guard watching. Instead, she clasped his bound hands briefly. "Of course I came. Did you think I wouldn't? Most people don't keep promises made to men like me." His voice was rough from disuse or perhaps from questioning. I'm not most people, Sarah reminded him. She glanced meaningfully at his bruised face. They've mistreated you. Matthew shrugged. Lieutenant Wade has strong feelings about loyalty. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she focused on what mattered. There's a hearing tomorrow morning. Colonel Prescott has agreed to a proper trial. Prescott's a fair man, Matthew acknowledged. Better than most. But Sarah, my actions are clear. I warned the winter camp. I can't deny it, and I won't. Then don't, Sarah said firmly. Tell the truth, that you prevented the massacre of innocent women and children, that you chose humanity over blind obedience. Matthew shook his head slightly. The army doesn't see it that way. To them, I betrayed my oath. Then we'll make them see differently. Sarah squeezed his hands. I've proposed that after whatever punishment they deem appropriate, you be released into my employment. To work, my land. Matthew stared at her. You would stake your reputation on me, the half-breed deserter? I already have, Sarah replied simply. The guard rapped on the door. Time's up, ma'am. Sarah held Matthew's gaze. Tomorrow, at the hearing. Tell your truth, I'll do the rest. As she was led away, Sarah caught a glimpse of something in Matthew's eyes she hadn't seen before. Not just gratitude or admiration, but a fragile, newborn hope. That night, in the sparse guest quarters, Sarah barely slept. She reviewed her arguments, anticipated objections, and planned her approach for the hearing. Dawn found her dressed in her cleanest outfit, a dark blue dress she had carefully packed for this purpose, and with her hair neatly arranged. The key hearing was held in the fort's assembly room, a plain space with wooden benches and a table where Colonel Prescott sat with 2 other officers. Lieutenant Wade stood to one side, his expression smug. Matthew was brought in by armed guards, his wrists still manacled, his face impassive. Sarah sat on the front bench, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She noted with interest that several of the fort's officers had chosen to attend, along with a man in civilian clothes who appeared to be taking notes, perhaps a newspaper correspondent. Colonel Prescott called the hearing to order with a bang of his gavel. Scout Matthew Blackwood, you stand accused of desertion and betraying military operations to hostiles. How do you plead? Matthew's voice rang clear in the quiet room. I warned innocent people of an impending attack. I don't deny it. Murmurs spread through the assembled observers. Prescott frowned. That is not a proper plea, Scout. Then guilty of preventing a massacre, Matthew amended. Not guilty of treason. This is a waste of time, Lieutenant Wade interjected. He admits to warning the hostiles. Hang him and be done with it. Lieutenant, Prescott said sharply, you will maintain proper decorum or you will be removed. He turned back to Matthew. The court will record a plea of guilty. As per regulations, you may speak in your own defense before sentencing. Matthew straightened, his chains clinking softly. I was recruited as a scout because of my knowledge of the land and the Lakota people. I was told my role was to help prevent unnecessary bloodshed by facilitating understanding between the army and the tribes. He paused, looking around the room. 3 weeks ago, Lieutenant Wade ordered preparations for an attack on what he called a hostile camp. I knew this camp. It was primarily women, children, and elders, a few hunters, but no war party. I informed the lieutenant of this fact. Wade stepped forward. The scout's information was disregarded because we had reliable intelligence that several warriors wanted for attacks on settlers were sheltering there. And was this intelligence verified? Sarah found herself on her feet, unable to remain silent. Prescott looked startled. Mrs. Thornwood, while you are permitted to observe these proceedings, you are not. I am a witness to Matthew's character and actions, Sarah interrupted, and I have questions material to these proceedings. The colonel hesitated, then nodded. Reluctantly. Proceed but briefly. Sarah turned to Wade. Lieutenant, Did you personally verify this intelligence about wanted warriors, or did you plan to attack an entire camp, including women and children, based on unconfirmed reports? Wade's face flushed. We don't need to verify every detail when dealing with hostiles. So you ordered an attack that would have killed innocent people, Sarah pressed, and when Matthew tried to prevent that tragedy, you labeled him a traitor. Mrs. Thornwood, Colonel Prescott interrupted, your point is made. He turned to Matthew. Continue, Scout. Matthew nodded. I could not be part of an action that would murder innocents. So yes, I rode to warn the camp. I accept responsibility. And for that decision, what happened after you warned the camp? Prescott asked. I was shot while leaving by a warrior who considered me a traitor to the Lakota. I managed to ride several miles before collapsing at Mrs. Thornwood's cabin. She saved my life. Sarah noticed several of the officers exchanging glances. The story of being shot by those he had tried to help seemed to affect them. And during your recovery, Prescott continued, what information did you share with the hostiles about army operations? Matthew shook his head. None, sir. I had no further contact with any Lakota until the morning Lieutenant Wade's patrol arrived. Wade snorted in disbelief. We're supposed to take the word of a deserter? You have my word as well, Colonel, Sarah interjected. Matthew was either unconscious or under my direct supervision for the entire 3 weeks of his recovery. He had no opportunity to communicate with anyone. Prescott considered this, then asked, Mrs. Thornwood, would you be willing to testify under oath that the scout made no attempt to contact hostiles during his time in your care? I would, Colonel, Sarah replied without hesitation. Furthermore, I can testify that when Lakota warriors did arrive at my cabin, Matthew was prepared to surrender himself to save my life. This caused a stir among the observers. The colonel waited for the murmurs to subside before addressing Matthew again. Scout Blackwood, you have admitted to desertion and warning hostiles of a military operation. These are serious offenses. Regardless of your motives, do you have anything else to say before this court determines your sentence? Matthew looked directly at Colonel Prescott. Only this, sir. I've spent my life trying to bridge two worlds that view each other with suspicion and hatred. I believed that serving as a scout would help prevent bloodshed, not cause it. If that belief was mistaken, then I accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate, but I cannot and will not apologize for preventing the massacre of innocents. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah held her breath as Prescott conferred quietly with the other officers. Several minutes passed before he addressed the room again. Matthew Blackwood, this court finds you guilty of desertion under Article 47 of the Articles of War. Prescott's voice was formal, but not harsh. However, given the unusual circumstances and your prior service record, we are exercising discretion. In sentencing, Sarah felt hope rise in her chest. You are hereby sentenced to 6 months confinement, reduced to time served plus 30 days. Prescott continued, following your confinement, you will be dishonorably discharged from all military service. Lieutenant Wade stepped forward angrily. Colonel, this is absurdly lenient for... Lieutenant! Prescott's voice cracked like a whip. The court has rendered its decision. Furthermore, I am placing a formal reprimand in your file for planning an attack on a non-military target without proper verification of intelligence. Wade's face drained of color as he snapped to attention. Yes, sir. Prescott turned back to Matthew. Additionally, this court acknowledges Mrs. Thornwood's offer of employment following your release. Upon completion of your 30 days confinement, you will be released into her custody on the condition that you remain within the boundaries of her homestead for 1 year, effectively under house arrest. Any violation will result in your immediate rearrest and imprisonment. Do you understand these terms? Matthew nodded, a complex mix of emotions crossing his face. I do, sir. Thank you. As the hearing concluded, Sarah felt lightheaded with relief. 30 days. It wasn't freedom, but it was far better than the hanging Wade had wanted or years in a military prison. And afterward, Matthew would come to her homestead, officially as an employee under house arrest, but in reality as someone who might help her build something meaningful from the wilderness Thomas had brought her to. Outside the assembly room, Sarah was surprised when Colonel Prescott approached her. "Mrs. Thornwood, a word before you depart." She followed him to a quiet corner of the parade ground, curious about his grave expression. "You should know," he said quietly, "that your intervention today likely saved that young man's life. Lieutenant Wade was pushing for a field execution." "Thank you for your fairness, Colonel," Sarah replied. Prescott shook his head slightly. "Don't mistake pragmatism for charity. The Lakota situation is deteriorating. War seems inevitable after the incidents in the Black Hills. When that comes, men like Blackwood, who understand both sides, will be valuable." "So you're using him," Sarah observed. "As you are," Prescott countered with a knowing look. "You need help with your homestead, and he needs sanctuary, a practical arrangement." Sarah felt her cheeks warm but maintained her composure. "Is there something specific you wish to tell me, Colonel?" "Yes." His expression grew more serious. "When Blackwood is released to your custody, you'll become responsible for him in the eyes of both the Army and the Lakota. Neither side fully trusts him. Both will be watching." "I'm aware of the complications." "Are you?" Prescott asked sharply. "Your homestead sits in contested territory. By harboring a man considered a traitor by some on both sides, you're placing yourself in the crossfire." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I made my choice when I opened my door to a wounded man, Colonel. I'll live with the consequences." Prescott studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "You're welcome to remain at the fort until Blackwood's release, though that may raise eyebrows. Alternatively, I can provide an escort for your return journey." "I'll stay," Sarah said firmly. "I've come this far. I'll see it through." As Sarah walked away, she felt the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. She had won Matthew a chance at freedom, but at what cost? Colonel Prescott was right. By tying her fate to Matthew's, she had placed herself between two colliding worlds. Yet as she looked across the fort to the distant plains where her small cabin waited, Sarah felt no regret. For the first time since Thomas's death, she had a purpose beyond mere survival. Whether that purpose was simply giving a good man a second chance or something more, something she wasn't yet ready to name, remained to be seen. The next 30 days would give her time to prepare. Not just the homestead for Matthew's arrival, but herself for whatever challenges lay ahead. Sarah Thornwood had come to Fort Lincoln as a widow seeking justice for a man who had collapsed on her doorstep. She would return as something more complex, a frontier woman who had defied both Army officers and Lakota warriors to forge her own path. As the spring sun warmed her face, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, uncertainty felt like possibility rather than fear. And that, perhaps, was the most unexpected gift of all. The 30 days of Matthew's remaining confinement passed more quickly than Sarah anticipated. She had expected to feel like an unwelcome intruder at Fort Lincoln, but to her surprise, she found herself becoming something of a curiosity, and eventually, a respected presence. Colonel Prescott's wife, Eleanor, took Sarah under her wing, inviting her to dinner and introducing her to the small circle of officers' wives. Sarah's story, embellished in the telling and retelling, had transformed her from a peculiar frontier widow into something of a romantic figure. The brave woman who had survived alone, nursed a wounded man, and faced down both Army patrols and Lakota war parties, You realize you've become a legend in certain circles, Eleanor told her over tea on the Prescott's porch one afternoon. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and a practical manner that reminded Sarah of her own mother. Sarah smiled. Hardly. I did what anyone would do. My dear, most women would have barred their doors at the sight of a bleeding half Lakota man on their porch. Most certainly wouldn't have ridden 4 days to Fort Lincoln to advocate for him. Eleanor studied her thoughtfully. William, Colonel Prescott, speaks highly of your composure at the hearing. Your husband is a fair man, Sarah replied diplomatically. He is that. Eleanor sipped her tea. He also believes you're either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish to take responsibility for Matthew Blackwood. Sarah met the older woman's gaze. Perhaps both. Does that concern you? Not at all. The world needs more brave fools. Eleanor set down her cup. However, if you're determined to proceed with this arrangement, you should be prepared for what awaits you. I'm listening. Eleanor lowered her voice, though no one else was within earshot on the wide porch. The situation with the Lakota is deteriorating rapidly. Gold in the Black Hills has brought hundreds of miners into treaty lands. The Army has orders to protect American citizens, even while acknowledging their trespassing on Lakota territory. An impossible position, Sarah observed, precisely, and you're placing yourself squarely in the middle of it by harboring a man neither side fully trusts. Eleanor leaned forward. Sarah, I've lived on frontier posts for 30 years. I've seen how quickly situations can shift from uneasy peace to open conflict. What are you suggesting? That you consider returning east, sell your homestead, start fresh somewhere safer? Sarah was silent for a long moment, looking out past the forts, walls to the vast expanse of prairie beyond. The land that had once seemed so alien to her now felt like her own in a way she couldn't fully explain, not even to herself. I can't, she said finally. Not now. Eleanor nodded, as if she'd expected this answer. Then at least accept some help. William has arranged for additional supplies for your return journey, preserved food, ammunition, medicine, and there's something else. From her pocket, Eleanor produced a small object and pressed it into Sarah's hand. It was a silver whistle on a sturdy chain. Army officers carry these, she explained. The sound carries for miles across open country. If you find yourself in danger, use it. Patrols circulate regularly within 20 miles of here. Sarah closed, her fingers around the whistle, touched by the unexpected kindness. Thank you. One more thing, Eleanor added, her expression serious. When you return with Blackwood, there will be talk, speculation about your arrangement. Are you prepared for that? Sarah felt a flush rise to her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. Matthew will be my employee, working off his debt to me for saving his life and securing his freedom. Nothing more. Eleanor's knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Of course. But remember, on the frontier, appearances matter as much as reality. Being a woman alone makes you vulnerable. Being a woman alone with a man who isn't your husband, particularly a man of mixed blood, makes you a target for more than just gossip. I'm aware of the challenges, Sarah assured her, though privately she wondered if she truly understood what awaited her. On the morning of Matthew's release, Sarah was surprised to find that Colonel Prescott had arranged a proper escort for their journey, 4 soldiers who would accompany them back to her homestead. The colonel himself oversaw the preparations, inspecting the wagon loaded with supplies he had authorized. The men will help you make necessary repairs to your property, he explained. Lieutenant Clark will also draft proper documentation establishing your land as neutral territory, as per your arrangement with Lieutenant Wade. Sarah was taken aback by such generosity. This is more than I expected, Colonel. Prescott lowered his voice. Consider it an investment in future stability. Your homestead sits at a strategic location between major Lakota hunting grounds and the main trail to the Black Hills. Having a neutral party there, especially one who has earned some measure of respect from both sides, could prove valuable. Before Sarah could respond, the stockade door opened and Matthew emerged, blinking in the bright spring sunlight. His face was leaner than she remembered, with several days' growth of beard, but he stood straight and proud despite the manacles. Still binding his wrists, Colonel Prescott approached him, holding the official discharge papers. "Scout Blackwood, you are hereby released into Mrs. Thornwood's custody for the period of 1 year. During this time, you will remain within the boundaries of her property unless given explicit permission by a military authority. Any violation of these terms will result in your immediate arrest and imprisonment. Do you understand these conditions?" "I do, sir," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "Then I release you to Mrs. Thornwood's custody." Prescott nodded to a soldier who stepped forward to remove the manacles. As the iron cuffs fell away, Matthew rubbed his wrists, looking first at Prescott, then at Sarah, with an expression that mingled gratitude, uncertainty, and something deeper that Sarah couldn't quite name. "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah said, extending her hand to the officer. "For everything." Prescott shook her hand firmly. "Good luck, Mrs. Thornwood. I suspect you'll need it." The journey back to Sarah's homestead took 3 days. Faster than her. Solitary ride to the fort thanks to better weather and the military escort. Matthew rode silently for much of the time, occasionally answering questions from the soldiers but offering little conversation. Sarah noticed how he scanned the horizon constantly, his eyes alert for any sign of movement. On the second night, as they camped beside a small creek, Lieutenant Clark approached Sarah as she collected water. "Mrs. Thornwood, may I speak frankly?" he asked, a young man with earnest features and the cautious manner of someone new to command. "Of course, Lieutenant. Some of the men are concerned about leaving you alone with the prisoner once we depart." Clark shifted uncomfortably. Given his background and recent actions, Matthew Blackwood saved 43 lives by warning that winter camp. Sarah interrupted, keeping her voice low but firm. "Including 18 children. That hardly makes him dangerous." "With respect, ma'am, he betrayed his oath to the army. A man who betrays one loyalty might betray another." Sarah straightened, meeting the lieutenant's gaze directly. "Do you have children, Lieutenant Clark?" "A daughter, ma'am, 3 years old." "And if someone threatened her life, even if that someone wore a uniform, what would you do?" Clark didn't answer, but his expression told Sarah he understood her point. "Matthew chose humanity over blind obedience," she continued softly. "I trust him precisely because of that choice, not despite it." The lieutenant nodded slowly. "I hope. Your trust is well placed, ma'am." "As do I," Sarah replied honestly, "but it's my risk to take." Late on the 3rd day, as the sun was beginning to set, they crested the final ridge, and Sarah's cabin came into view in the small valley below. The sight of it, sturdy and unchanged despite all that had happened, brought an unexpected lump to her throat. For better or worse, this was home now. The soldiers worked efficiently the next morning, repairing Sarah's roof, reinforcing the barn, and clearing brush that had grown too close to the structures. Lieutenant Clark officially marked the boundaries of Sarah's property, placing small stone cairns at the corners of her land and documenting them carefully for military records. Matthew worked alongside the soldiers, saying little but watching everything. Sarah noticed how he observed their military efficiency with a hint of nostalgia, as if remembering his own days in their ranks. By mid-afternoon, the work was complete, and Lieutenant Clark presented Sarah with official documentation, declaring her homestead neutral territory, a small island of peace in an increasingly tense frontier. "This decree is recognized by the United States Army," Clark explained, but I can't guarantee the Lakota will honor it, despite your previous understanding with their chief." "Standing Bear is a man of his word," Matthew said quietly. The first time he'd spoken directly to the lieutenant. If he promised to respect this land, he will. Clark regarded Matthew with undisguised skepticism, but nodded curtly. "For your sake, Mrs. Thornwood, I hope that's true." He turned to his men. "We depart in 30 minutes. Pack up." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Sarah found herself suddenly anxious about their departure. Despite her brave words to Lieutenant Clark, the reality of being alone with Matthew, a man she had fought for but still knew little about, was more daunting than she had anticipated. "The Army patrol routes pass within 5 miles of here," Clark told her as he mounted his horse. "If you need assistance, use the whistle Colonel Prescott provided. Sound it 3 times in succession. A patrol should hear it." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Sarah said, standing tall despite her apprehension. "I'm grateful for all your help." Clark glanced at Matthew, who stood a respectful distance away. "Remember, Blackwood, 1 year within these boundaries. Violate those terms and—" "I understand my obligations," Matthew interrupted, his voice even. The lieutenant nodded stiffly, then signaled to his men. Within minutes, the soldiers had ridden out, leaving Sarah and Matthew standing in awkward silence outside the cabin they would now share. "I should check the western fence line before dark," Matthew said after a moment. "The spring thaw often damages the posts." Sarah nodded, relieved at the practical focus. "I'll prepare supper." As Matthew walked away, Sarah watched him go, struck by the strangeness of their situation. This man had gone from bleeding stranger to prisoner to employee in a matter of weeks. Now they would live together on this isolated homestead, bound by circumstances neither could have imagined. That evening, they ate a simple meal at the small table Thomas had built. The familiar domestic setting felt suddenly strange with Matthew, sitting in what had been Thomas's chair. Sarah found herself studying his face in the lamplight, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the way his dark eyes reflected the flame, the small scar above his right eyebrow she had never noticed before. "You're staring," Matthew observed without looking up from his plate. Sarah flushed. "I'm sorry, this is unusual for both of us." "Indeed." He met her eyes then. "Why did you do it, Sarah? Risk everything for me?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "I told you at the fort, I believe in your innocence." "That's not a complete answer." Sarah set down her fork, considering her words carefully. "When Thomas died, I lost my purpose. I was just existing, waiting for spring so I could leave." She gestured around the cabin. "Then you arrived, and suddenly there was something that mattered again, something I could fight for." "So I was convenient," Matthew said, his tone unreadable. "No." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "You were necessary. You reminded me that even in this harsh place, compassion matters. Justice matters." Matthew was silent for a long moment. "And now? What happens now that you've won your fight?" It was the question Sarah had been asking herself for 30 days at Fort Lincoln. "Now we build something here. Something that honors what we both believe, that there can be understanding between different worlds." "A noble sentiment," Matthew said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "But the reality is more complicated. The Lakota see me as a traitor, the Army sees me as a deserter, and you—" "I see you as a man of honor," Sarah finished for him. "A man who made a difficult choice when faced with an impossible situation." Matthew's expression softened slightly. "Your faith is unexpected." "As was finding you on my doorstep," Sarah countered with a small smile. "Perhaps we were meant to find each other." The words hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address. Matthew broke the tension by standing and carrying his plate to the wash basin. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, his back to her. "It's more appropriate." You don't have to. Yes, he interrupted gently. I do, for both our sakes. Sarah understood. Their situation was precarious enough without inviting more scandal. Very well, there are extra blankets in the trunk by the door. Matthew nodded, gathering what he needed. At the door, he paused. Sarah, thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for believing it was worth saving. After he left, Sarah sat alone at the table, the cabin suddenly feeling too quiet and too large. She had fought so hard to bring Matthew back here, convinced it was the right thing to do. Now that he was here, the path forward seemed less clear than she had imagined. Outside, an owl called in the darkness. Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky and the shadowy outline of the barn where Matthew now slept. This strange arrangement was their reality now, a widow and a former scout, bound together by circumstance, trying to forge a life on contested ground. The next few weeks established a cautious routine. Matthew worked from dawn till dusk, repairing fences, planting a vegetable garden, hunting game to supplement their supplies. Sarah tended to household tasks, occasionally riding to the nearest trading post for necessities they couldn't produce themselves. They were polite but careful with each other, maintaining a respectful distance despite living in such close quarters. Matthew continued to sleep in the barn, coming to the cabin only for meals and occasional evening conversations. It was during one such evening, as a spring thunderstorm rattled the windows, that Matthew asked about Thomas. "What was he like, your husband?" Sarah was surprised by the question. "Thomas was passionate, idealistic. He believed we could build something meaningful here." She smiled at a memory. "He used to say that the frontier wasn't just a place, but a chance to begin again, to create something better than what we'd left behind." "You loved him deeply," Matthew observed. "I did," Sarah acknowledged, "but I didn't share his romantic vision of pioneer life. I came west because he asked me to, not because I yearned for it myself." And now, Sarah looked around the cabin, at the home she had fought to preserve, the land she had claimed as neutral territory. "Now I understand what he saw, the possibility of it. The freedom to define your own path." Matthew nodded slowly. "That's what I've sought my entire life, a place to define my own path, not one chosen for me by either world." For the first time, Sarah felt she truly understood him. This man caught between cultures, seeking not just a physical home, but a place where his divided identity could find peace. "Perhaps we're not so different after all," she said softly. Thunderstorm raged on, but inside the cabin, something subtle had shifted between them. Not romance. It was too soon, too complicated for that. But a deeper understanding, a recognition of shared purpose despite their vastly different journeys. As spring turned to early summer, their careful routine was interrupted by unexpected visitors. Sarah was hanging laundry when she spotted 3 riders approaching from the east, not soldiers in uniform, but men in rough frontier clothing. Matthew emerged from the barn immediately, a rifle in his hands, though held casually, not raised. He positioned himself between Sarah and the approaching riders. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "These men aren't from the fort." Sarah felt a flutter of alarm, but stood her ground. "This is my homestead. I'll greet visitors myself." Before Matthew could argue, she stepped forward, though she noted with appreciation that he remained close, the rifle ready. The riders stopped at a respectful distance. The leader, a burly man with a thick beard and weather-beaten face, touched his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am. Name's Jackson Harris. These are my associates, Cooper and Dalton. We're surveyors for the Black Hills Mining Company." "Sarah Thornwood," she replied evenly. "This is Matthew Blackwood, my associate." Harris's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Matthew's appearance, clearly recognizing his Lakota heritage, but he maintained his civil tone. Pleasure, ma'am. We're mapping routes to the new gold fields. Wondered if we might trouble you for water for our horses, maybe trade for some supplies. Sarah noticed how his gaze swept over her property, assessing it with more than casual interest. You're welcome to water your horses at the creek, she said. As for supplies, we have little to spare, but I can offer a hot meal before you continue your journey. Harris smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Most kind, ma'am. As the men dismounted, Matthew moved closer to Sarah. Be careful, he murmured. These aren't just surveyors. They're scouts for the mining companies looking for land to claim. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly. She had suspected as much. Then let's show them that this land is already firmly claimed. The afternoon that followed was a careful dance of frontier hospitality underlined with wariness. Sarah served the men, a simple meal on the porch rather than inviting them into her home. Matthew stayed visible, competent and alert, a clear message that Sarah was well protected. Throughout the meal, Harris asked seemingly casual questions about the surrounding area, nearby water sources, and the local Lakota presence. Sarah answered honestly but carefully, emphasizing that her homestead was officially recognized as neutral territory. Neutral, you say? Harris seemed intrigued. Meaning the hostiles leave you be? The Lakota respect our boundaries, Sarah corrected him. As does the army. We maintain peaceful relations with both. Harris exchanged glances with his companions. Unusual arrangement, especially for a woman alone. I'm not alone, Sarah replied, nodding toward Matthew, who was splitting wood within earshot. Harris studied Matthew for a moment, then lowered his voice. Mrs. Thornwood, if you don't mind my saying so, this is prime land you're sitting on. Water, timber, good positioning. Mining company would pay handsomely for a place like this, especially one with diplomatic advantages. My homestead is not for sale, Mr. Harris. The surveyor leaned back, smiling easily. Everything has a price, ma'am, especially out here where life can get unpredictable. The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. I believe your horses are watered, Mr. Harris, she said, rising from her chair. I wish you safe travels to the Black Hills. Harris stood, recognizing the dismissal. Think on my words, Mrs. Thornwood. Company men will be passing through regular. Now, good to have friends in these uncertain times. As the three men rode away, Matthew approached Sarah, his expression grim. They'll be back, he said, or others like them. Sarah nodded, watching the dust rise from the departing riders. I know. The gold in the Black Hills changes everything, doesn't it? It was always coming, Matthew replied. The only question was when. Sarah turned to face him, suddenly aware that their peaceful existence these past weeks had been merely a calm before an approaching storm. What do we do? She asked. Matthew's eyes met hers, serious but not without hope. We stand our ground together. In that moment, standing in the yard of the homestead she had nearly abandoned just months ago, Sarah realized how completely her life had transformed. She had come to the Dakota territory as Thomas's wife, following his dream. Now she stood as her own woman, defending her own vision alongside a man whose presence in her life would have once seemed impossible. The complications that lay ahead, with miners, the army, the Lakota, and even with Matthew himself, were daunting. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah felt truly alive, her purpose clear and her resolve unshakable. Together, she agreed, as the summer sun cast long shadows across the land they both now called home. Summer brought both beauty and tension to Sarah's homestead. The vegetable garden flourished under Matthew's careful tending. Wild prairie flowers created carpets of color across the rolling hills, and game was plentiful in the nearby woods. Yet with each passing week, signs of the changing frontier became impossible to ignore. More surveyors passed through, some stopping to water their horses, others merely observing the property from a distance. Army patrols increased, the soldiers tipping their hats to Sarah, but watching Matthew with undisguised suspicion. Twice, small bands of Lakota hunters crossed the edge of the property, acknowledging the boundary cairns with solemn nods, but never approaching the cabin. They're testing the boundaries, Matthew explained one evening after spotting a Lakota scout watching them from a distant ridge. Making sure we honor our word about neutral ground. Sarah paused in her mending. And have we honored our word? So far, Matthew's expression was troubled, but Standing Bear's influence has limits. Not all Lakota recognize his authority, especially the younger warriors. They see any white settlement as an intrusion, regardless of agreements. And the army feels the same about any Lakota presence, Sarah observed. We're caught between forces, growing more hostile by the day. Matthew nodded grimly. The discovery of gold has changed everything. There's talk of forcing all Lakota onto the reservation by year's end. The army's building up forces at Fort Lincoln. How do you know this? Sarah asked, curious about his sources of information. A faint smile touched Matthew's lips. I listen. When traders visit, I read the newspapers you bring back from the trading post. And? Sarah prompted when he hesitated. Sometimes Grey Wolf comes at night. He stays in the trees beyond the boundary cairn, honoring our agreement, but we talk. Sarah set down her mending. You never mentioned these meetings. I didn't want to worry you, Matthew admitted, or make you complicit if the army discovered these conversations. This is my homestead, Sarah reminded him firmly. I should know what happens here, especially communications with either side. Matthew studied her face, then nodded. You're right. I apologize. What does Grey Wolf tell you? That tensions are rising. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull are gathering warriors. They believe war is inevitable. Matthew's expression grew distant. He also says my cousin Running Elk, the one who shot me, leads a band of young warriors who view this homestead as a betrayal. They respect Standing Bear enough not to violate his agreement, but their patience wears thin. Sarah absorbed this troubling information in silence. The delicate peace they had established felt increasingly fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. What about the army? She asked. What would they do if they knew you were meeting with Grey Wolf? Consider it proof of their suspicions, Matthew replied bluntly. Lieutenant Wade still believes I'm a spy. He'd use any excuse to arrest me and throw me in the stockade. Or worse. Sarah's jaw tightened at the mention of Wade. Then we must be more careful. If Grey Wolf comes again, bring him to the cabin. Better to meet openly than to fuel suspicions with secretive conversations. Matthew raised an eyebrow. You would welcome a Lakota warrior into your home. I would welcome the brother of a woman whose child I helped save, Sarah corrected him. This homestead is neutral ground. Let's truly make it so. 2 nights later, Sarah was awakened by a soft knock at her door. She reached instinctively for the revolver she kept nearby, then relaxed when she heard Matthew's voice. Sarah, it's me. Grey Wolf is here. She hastily pulled on a shawl over her nightgown and lit a lamp. When she opened the door, Matthew stood, there with a tall, imposing figure, the same warrior who had translated for Standing Bear months earlier. Grey Wolf looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the cabin interior as if expecting a trap. He wore buckskin leggings and a calico shirt common among Lakota who traded with whites, his long hair in 2 braids wrapped with strips of red cloth. Welcome to my home, Sarah said, gesturing toward the table. Please, sit. Grey Wolf hesitated, exchanging glances with Matthew, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, the warrior took a seat, his posture tense. I will make coffee, Sarah offered, moving to the stove. As she prepared the drinks, the two men conversed quietly in Lakota. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the urgent tone was unmistakable. When she placed steaming cups before them, Matthew switched to English. "Grey Wolf brings news," he explained. "A large gold discovery in the heart of the Black Hills has been confirmed. Hundreds of miners are already trespassing on sacred Lakota ground. The government has offered to buy the land, but the tribal councils have refused." Grey Wolf spoke, his English careful but clear. "The yellow-haired general leads soldiers into our hunting grounds next moon. They say to protect miners. We say to steal our land." "Custer," Matthew translated unnecessarily. "He's been ordered to escort a scientific expedition into the Black Hills, but everyone knows the real purpose is to assess gold deposits and establish military control." Sarah's heart sank. General George Armstrong Custer's reputation for aggressive tactics was well known, even on the frontier. "This will lead to war," she said quietly. Grey Wolf nodded solemnly. "Many moons, my people have watched white settlers take more land, break more promises. Now they come for the sacred hills where our ancestors' spirits dwell. The young men will not accept this theft. They prepare for battle." "What about Standing Bear?" Sarah asked. "Does he also prepare for war?" "My father is old," Grey Wolf replied. "He remembers other wars, other broken promises. He wishes for peace, but even he cannot ignore this violation." Matthew leaned forward. "Grey Wolf came to warn us. If war comes, our position here becomes dangerous. The army will view any neutral party as potentially hostile. The Lakota may see us as allies of the Bluecoats simply because we're on settled land." "What would you have us do?" Sarah asked the Lakota warrior directly. "Abandon our home." Grey Wolf's expression remained impassive. "The woman who wears my sister's bracelet has shown courage. Black Crow," he nodded toward Matthew, "has chosen his path. I come not to tell you to leave, but to warn of what approaches. The storm comes. You must decide how to weather it." The three talked long into the night, Sarah listening carefully as Grey Wolf described troop movements and Lakota preparations. Despite his measured words, she sensed his deep anger at the impending violation of his people's sacred lands. As dawn approached, Grey Wolf rose to leave. At the door, he turned to Sarah. "My sister says you have a good heart. She says the spirits guided Black Crow to your door, because you see with clear eyes. I hope she is right." After he had gone, Matthew and Sarah sat in silence, watching the first pale light of morning creep through the windows. "We should consider leaving," Matthew said finally, "at least until tensions ease. Eleanor Prescott offered you a place at the fort." Sarah shook her head firmly. "If we leave, we abandon everything we've built here, not just the homestead, but the idea of it. Neutral ground where different worlds can meet in peace. That idea may be a luxury we can no longer afford," Matthew argued. "Grey Wolf didn't say it directly, but I know what's coming. The army will establish more outposts. Miners will swarm. The Black Hills, the Lakota will resist. This cabin sits squarely between those forces." "Then this is exactly where we need to be," Sarah insisted. A voice for reason amid the madness. Matthew studied her face in the dim light, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever known, or the most stubborn." Sarah's smile was tinged with sadness. "Thomas always said the same thing." Perhaps both are true. The next weeks brought increased activity on all fronts. Army patrols passed by more frequently, the soldiers tense and watchful. More miners and settlers traveled the nearby trail, many stopping to water their horses at Sarah's Creek. Some offered to buy the homestead, their prices climbing as Sarah repeatedly refused. $2,000, Matthew said incredulously, after one particularly persistent buyer had departed. "That's a fortune on the frontier. This land isn't for sale at any price," Sarah replied. though she had been momentarily tempted by the offer. With such money, they could return east, perhaps build a new life somewhere safer. But something held her here, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Thomas's death, a conviction that the stand they were making mattered beyond just their own lives. One sultry August afternoon, Sarah was preserving vegetables from the garden when she heard the approach of horses. Looking out the window, her heart sank at the sight of Lieutenant Wade leading a patrol of 6 soldiers toward her cabin. She quickly wiped her hands and stepped onto the porch as Matthew emerged from the barn, his posture wary but composed. "Lieutenant Wade," Sarah greeted him coolly, "what brings you to our homestead?" Wade dismounted, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. Thornwood, just a routine patrol, checking on the welfare of settlers in the area, given the increasing hostilities." His gaze shifted to Matthew, hardening visibly. "Blackwood, still keeping to the terms of your release, I trust?" "As you can see, Lieutenant," Matthew replied evenly, "I remain within the boundaries, as required." Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes, indeed, though I wonder what else remains within your boundaries. He turned back to Sarah. "Mrs. Thornwood, we've received reports of Lakota movements in this area. Specifically, a warrior identified as Grey Wolf has been seen near your property on multiple occasions." Sarah maintained a neutral expression, though her pulse quickened. "Many Lakota pass near our land, Lieutenant. We have an understanding with Chief Standing Bear that they respect our boundaries, as do we." "An understanding?" Wade repeated, his tone skeptical. "And do these understandings include nighttime meetings?" Sarah felt Matthew tense beside her, but she kept her voice steady. "This is neutral ground, Lieutenant, recognized as such by Colonel Prescott himself. That means we speak with travelers from all directions. We hide nothing." Wade stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mrs. Thornwood, your arrangement was unusual but tolerated when tensions were lower. Now with war brewing, neutrality becomes problematic. The army needs to know where people's loyalties lie." "My loyalty is to peace, Lieutenant," Sarah replied firmly. "Something increasingly rare on this frontier." Wade's jaw tightened. "Peace requires security, ma'am. Security requires vigilance against threats." His gaze flickered to Matthew, "including those who have already proven their willingness to betray their oaths." Matthew took a step forward, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm, silently urging restraint. "Lieutenant," she said carefully, "we appreciate your concern for our safety, but as you can see, we're managing quite well. Is there something specific you need from us today?" Wade studied her for a long moment, then replaced his hat. "Just doing my duty. Ma'am, Colonel Prescott sends his regards. He suggested I remind you that Fort Lincoln's doors remain open should you reconsider your situation here." "Please thank the Colonel for his continued concern," Sarah replied. "We're not leaving." As Wade prepared to remount, he paused, reaching into his saddlebag. "Nearly forgot. Mail's been piling up for you at the fort." He handed Sarah a small bundle of letters tied with string. "Thought you might want news from civilization." Sarah accepted the letters with a nod of thanks, recognizing her sister's handwriting on the top envelope. Wade's thoughtfulness was clearly another reminder of the world she had left behind, a world he believed she should return to. After the patrol departed, Matthew's expression was grim. "They're watching us more closely than I realized. Wade didn't come here on routine patrol. He was looking for evidence." "Evidence of what?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Of divided loyalties, of communication with the Lakota." Matthew ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "He's building a case against me and possibly against you as an accomplice." Sarah looked down at the letters in her hand, feeling the weight of her choices. Her sister's words would undoubtedly urge her to return east, to safety, to the life as she had once known. "What do we do now?" she asked softly. Matthew was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where dust from Wade's departing patrol still hung in the air. "We need allies," he said finally. "People who can vouch for our neutrality to both sides. The Prescotts clearly support us, but they're constrained by military protocol. We need others, settlers, traders, anyone who can attest to our even-handedness." Sarah nodded slowly, an idea forming. "The trading post at Willow Creek. Jenkins, the owner, has been fair to both settlers and Lakota. He mentioned a church group from back east that's been mediating disputes. Perhaps they could help establish our legitimacy." Matthew considered this. "It's worth trying, but we need to be careful. Wade's watching for any hint of communication. With the Lakota, if he catches Grey Wolf here again, then Grey Wolf can't come here," Sarah concluded, "but perhaps we could meet elsewhere. At the trading post, perhaps. In public, where our interactions would be seen as the peaceful negotiations they are, not as conspiracy." A hint of admiration flickered in Matthew's eyes. "You're becoming quite the frontier diplomat." "I'm learning," Sarah acknowledged. "From necessity." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, Sarah finally opened her sister's letters. As expected, Elizabeth's words were full of concern and pleas for Sarah to return to Pennsylvania. "My sister thinks I've gone mad," Sarah said, folding the last letter with a sigh. "She's arranged a position for me teaching at a girls' school in Philadelphia. Says I can start whenever I arrive." Matthew was silent for a moment. "It's a reasonable option. Safe. Secure. And wrong for me," Sarah replied firmly. "At least for now." "Why?" Matthew asked, turning to face her fully. "Why stay in this dangerous place when you have alternatives? Your husband is gone. The dream you followed here was his, not yours." Sarah considered the question carefully. "At first I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. Then I stayed for you, to secure your freedom. But now—" She looked out at the land stretching before them, at the garden they had planted together, at the cabin that had become truly her home. "Now I stay because this is where I belong, where I can make a difference, even if that difference comes at great personal risk." "Perhaps because of that risk," Sarah admitted. "Back east, I was Thomas's wife, then his widow. Here, I'm Sarah. Thornwood, just me, defined by my own choices." Matthew's expression softened. "I understand that better than most." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Sarah felt the familiar flutter in her chest that had been growing stronger in recent weeks. The proper distance they had maintained began to feel more like an arbitrary barrier than a necessary boundary. "Matthew," she began hesitantly, "these past months—" The moment was shattered by the distant sound of gunfire, followed by shouting carried on the evening breeze. They both stood, instantly alert. "That came from the eastern ridge," Matthew said already, moving toward the barn. "Near the trail to Willow Creek." Sarah hurried after him. "Miners clashing with Lakota." "Or Army patrol," Matthew replied grimly, emerging with a rifle. "Either way, it's trouble." Sarah grabbed her shawl and the revolver. "I'm coming with you. It could be dangerous," Matthew warned. "Everything is dangerous now," Sarah countered. "We face it together or not at all." They rode quickly toward the sounds of conflict, staying within the boundaries of their property, but climbing to the highest point that offered a view of the eastern ridge. Through the evening haze, they could make out figures moving among the rocks. Several men in civilian clothes, taking cover as arrows, occasionally flew from the tree line. "Miners or settlers," Matthew observed, "being attacked by Lakota." "Can you tell which band?" Sarah asked, straining to see details in the diminishing light. Matthew studied the distant figures, then inhaled sharply. "The warrior by the tall pine. That's Running Elk, my cousin. The name sent a chill through Sarah. The one who shot you? Matthew nodded grimly. And likely the leader of those who reject Standing Bear's neutrality agreement. This is deliberate. An attack this close to our homestead sends a message. What can we do? Sarah asked, watching helplessly as the conflict continued. Nothing from here, Matthew replied. We're still on our land. Moving closer would mean leaving the boundaries, violating my terms of release. Those people could die, Sarah protested. Matthew's expression was torn. If I intervene, Wade will have the excuse he needs to arrest me. If these are minors trespassing on hunting grounds, the Lakota would see my intervention as another betrayal. The impossible choice hung between them as more shots rang out. Then Sarah noticed something, riders approaching from the south, the unmistakable blue uniforms of an army patrol. Soldiers, she said, pointing. They must have heard the gunfire. As they watched, the army patrol galloped toward the skirmish, their rifles ready. The Lakota warriors melted back into the forest at their approach, vanishing like shadows in the gathering darkness. The miners emerged from their rocky shelter, gesturing animatedly as they spoke with the patrol leader. Come on, Matthew said, grimly. We need to get back to the cabin. When the soldiers finish there, they'll likely come to question us about what we saw. Sarah cast one last glance at the ridge, where soldiers now milled about, examining the site of the attack. This is just the beginning, isn't it? I'm afraid so, Matthew replied as they turned their horses homeward. The storm, Grey Wolf warned. Us about is breaking. Later that night, as expected, an army patrol arrived at their cabin, led by a sergeant Sarah didn't recognize. They answered his questions truthfully but carefully, confirming they had heard gunfire but had remained on their property as required by Matthew's terms of release. After the soldiers departed, Sarah and Matthew sat by the fire, the weight of the day's events heavy between them. Running Elk chose that location deliberately, Matthew said quietly. Close enough to our homestead to send a message, but not actually violating Standing Bear's agreement. What message? Sarah asked. That neutrality is an illusion, that eventually everyone must choose sides. Matthew's expression was troubled. And that my cousin hasn't forgotten what he sees as my betrayal. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she had initiated such contact between them. We've chosen our side, Matthew, not the army's, not the Lakota's. Our own path, where we stand for what's right, regardless of uniforms or ancestry. Matthew's fingers tightened around hers. That path grows narrower by the day. Then we walk it more carefully, Sarah replied, but we walk it together. In the flickering firelight, their joined hands cast a single shadow on the cabin wall. Two people from different worlds, finding common ground as the frontier around them descended into conflict. The journey ahead would test everything they believed about justice, loyalty, and the possibility of peace amid hatred. But in that moment, with the warmth of his hand in hers, Sarah found herself facing the gathering storm, not with fear, but with resolve. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything since that snowy night when a wounded man collapsed on her doorstep, with courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that even on the harshest frontier, humanity could still triumph over hatred. Autumn painted the Dakota Territory in brilliant hues of gold and crimson as the tensions that had simmered all summer finally boiled over. News reached Sarah's homestead in fragments, traders bringing rumors, army patrols confirming military movements, and occasional messages from Grey Wolf delivered through neutral merchants at the Willow Creek trading post. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. General Custer's expedition into the Black Hills had indeed confirmed rich gold deposits, triggering a flood of miners despite treaty protections. The government had issued an ultimatum to all Lakota to report to the reservations by January or be considered hostile. In response, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were gathering warriors in the Powder River country, preparing for resistance. "They're forcing a confrontation," Matthew explained, as they preserved the last of their garden harvest. "The deadline is impossible to meet. Many bands are hunting buffalo and won't even hear the order until spring. It's a pretext for war." Sarah sealed another jar of pickled vegetables, her movements efficient after months of frontier life. "What about Standing Bear's people?" "Divided, like all the bands. The older leaders counsel compliance to avoid bloodshed. The younger warriors, including Running Elk, have already joined Sitting Bull." Matthew's expression was troubled. "Grey Wolf is torn between loyalty to his father and solidarity with his people." "And you?" Sarah asked quietly. "Where do your loyalties lie in this conflict?" Matthew set down the knife he was using to slice apples. "You know the answer to that." "I need to hear it," Sarah insisted, "especially now." His dark eyes met hers. "My loyalty is here, to this place we've built, to you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Over the past months, their cautious partnership had evolved into something deeper, unspoken, but undeniable. The careful distance Matthew had initially maintained had gradually diminished, though he still slept in the barn, despite Sarah's hints that such arrangements were no longer necessary. "The army will expect you to choose sides soon," Sarah said. "So will the Lakota." "They already do," Matthew replied grimly. Lieutenant Wade made that clear during his last routine patrol. The army believes anyone not actively supporting them is potentially hostile. Sarah remembered Wade's thinly veiled threats during his last visit 2 weeks earlier, his implication that the Army's protection might not extend to those with questionable associations. "We've maintained our neutrality all these months," she said. "Surely Colonel Prescott would—" "Colonel Prescott has been reassigned to Fort Laramie," Matthew interrupted. "Major Wilson commands Fort Lincoln now, and he's a very different sort of officer. Wade has his ear." The news struck Sarah like a physical blow. Prescott had been their most influential ally within the military, the only commanding officer who fully respected their neutral status. "Then we've lost our protection," she concluded. "From the army, perhaps," Matthew acknowledged. "But Standing Bear still honors his agreement with you. His influence has limits, but it's something." Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the land that had become so precious to her. Their homestead had flourished under their combined efforts. Fields cleared, fences repaired, the cabin made truly comfortable. More importantly, they had maintained it as a place where different worlds could meet in peace, however briefly. "I won't give up what we've built here," she said firmly. "Not without a fight." Matthew came to stand beside her. "Some fights can't be won, Sarah." "Perhaps not," she conceded, "but they can be fought nonetheless." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching horses, many horses moving at speed. Matthew was instantly alert, grabbing his rifle from its place by the door. "Army patrol?" Sarah asked, reaching for her revolver. Matthew shook his head, his expression tense. "Too many, and coming from the wrong direction." They stepped onto the porch together, watching as a group of riders appeared on the ridge to the north. At least 15 men, not in uniform but dressed in the rough clothing of frontiersmen. They rode directly toward the cabin, with a purposefulness that set Sarah's nerves on edge. "Miners," Matthew said grimly, "or hired guns for the mining companies." Sarah recognized the leader as he drew closer. Jackson Harris, the surveyor who had visited months earlier with his talk of buying her land. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch, touching his hat with mock courtesy. "Mrs. Thornwood, been a while. Hope you've been well." "Mr. Harris," Sarah acknowledged coolly. "This is an unexpected visit." Harris's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd bring some friends to see this fine property. Times being what they are, figured you might have reconsidered my offer." Sarah noted how the men spread out, some dismounting, others remaining on horseback in a loose semicircle around the cabin. The implied threat was unmistakable. My position. Hasn't changed, Mr. Harris. This homestead is not for sale. Harris's smile faded. Ma'am, with respect, you may not fully appreciate the situation. War's coming to this territory, armies moving against the hostiles, and anyone caught between them will suffer. We're aware of the tensions, Sarah replied evenly. This land is recognized as neutral territory by both the army and the Lakota. Harris chuckled, several of his men joining in. Neutral? There's no such thing anymore, Mrs. Thornwood. Not with savages attacking settlers daily and the army preparing to clean them out. His gaze shifted to Matthew, hardening, especially not for a place harboring a half-breed deserter. Matthew's grip on his rifle tightened, but he remained silent, letting Sarah handle the confrontation. Mr. Blackwood is my employee, legally released into my custody by the military authorities, Sarah stated firmly. Our status is well documented and recognized by Fort Lincoln. Maybe it was, Harris acknowledged, but times change. New orders. Coming down. Word is, the Army's revoking special arrangements, requiring everyone to declare loyalty. He leaned forward in his saddle. Way I hear it, your friend here is about to be recalled to Fort Lincoln for questioning. Sarah felt a chill at this news, but kept her expression neutral. If official orders come, we'll address them officially. Now, unless you have actual business here, I'll ask you to leave my property. Harris sighed theatrically. Mrs. Thornwood, I'm trying to be reasonable. The mining company I represent is prepared to offer you $3,000 for this land. Far more than it's worth. Take the money, return east, live a comfortable life away from what's coming. And if I refuse, Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Harris's pretense of courtesy vanished. Then you'll likely lose everything anyway. Homestead Act requires continuous occupation. If circumstances force you to abandon this place, even temporarily, he shrugged, claims jumpers are always ready. Are you threatening me, Mr. Harris? Warning. You, he corrected. As a courtesy, war's no place for a woman alone. She's not alone, Matthew said, speaking for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying clear authority. Harris's expression darkened. No, she ain't. And that's part of the problem, ain't it? Army patrol came through yesterday, mentioned they'd be back today with some questions for you, Breed. Questions about your meetings with certain Lakota. Sarah and Matthew exchanged quick glances. This was new information and potentially dangerous. Whatever questions the Army has can be answered honestly, Sarah declared. We have nothing to hide. I'm sure, Harris said, his tone making clear he believed otherwise. Tell you what, I'll leave my offer open till sundown. Change your mind, send word to the trading post. He gathered his reins. Think carefully, Mrs. Thornwood. Once certain wheels start turning, they can't be stopped. As Harris and his men rode away, Sarah felt a rising sense of dread. Do you think he's telling the truth about the Army coming with questions? Unfortunately, yes, Matthew replied, watching the riders disappear over the ridge. Wade's been building his case against me for months. If he's convinced the new commander I'm communicating with hostiles, they could revoke my release. I can't, Sarah protested. We've done nothing wrong. In times of peace, perhaps, but with war looming, suspicion becomes evidence. Matthew turned to her, his expression grave. Sarah, Harris is right about one thing. You need to consider your position carefully. If I'm arrested, you'd be alone here, vulnerable to men like him. So you suggest I sell out? Accept his blood money and abandon everything we've built? I suggest you survive, Matthew said quietly. If not selling, then perhaps accepting Eleanor Prescott's offer to stay at Fort Laramie until the situation stabilizes. Sarah shook her head firmly. I'm not leaving, and neither are you. I may not have a choice if the Army comes with arrest orders. Then we'll have to ensure they don't find you, Sarah replied. a plan already forming in her mind. Grey Wolf once offered sanctuary with Standing Bear's band if things became dangerous. Perhaps it's time to accept. Matthew looked startled. You want me to flee to the Lakota? That would confirm every accusation Wade has made. Not flee, Sarah corrected. Seek temporary sanctuary while I address the legal situation. Colonel Prescott respected our arrangement. He would testify to that effect if needed. Fort Laramie is 5 days' hard ride, Matthew pointed out. And there's no guarantee Prescott would risk his career to help a suspected deserter. I have to try, Sarah insisted. We've fought too hard for this place to abandon it now. Before Matthew could respond, they heard the distant thunder of more. Approaching riders. From the east this time, the direction of Fort Lincoln. Army patrol, Matthew confirmed, his expression grim. Right on schedule. Sarah made a swift decision. There's no time to reach the Lakota camps. The root cellar. It has the hidden storage space Thomas built for valuable supplies. You can hide there until they leave. And if they search the property, I'll handle it, Sarah promised. Go quickly. As Matthew disappeared into the cabin, Sarah took a deep breath, composing herself for the confrontation ahead. By the time Lieutenant Wade's patrol appeared, she was calmly hanging laundry, presenting a picture of domestic tranquility. Wade dismounted, 5 soldiers flanking him. His eyes swept the homestead, clearly searching for Matthew. Lieutenant, Sarah greeted him with forced pleasantness. What brings you back so soon? Official business, Mrs. Thornwood. Wade produced a document from his saddlebag. I have orders to bring Matthew Blackwood to Fort Lincoln for questioning regarding suspected communication with hostile elements. Sarah accepted the paper, reading it carefully while fighting to keep her expression neutral. The order, signed by Major Wilson, cited credible evidence of treasonous correspondence with enemy combatants. I see, she said finally. Unfortunately, Mr. Blackwood isn't here at present. Wade's eyes narrowed. Where is he? At the Willow Creek trading post, Sarah lied smoothly. We needed supplies before winter sets in. He left early this morning. Convenient. Timing, Wade observed skeptically. You're aware that leaving the boundaries of this property violates the terms of his release. He had my permission as his legal custodian, Sarah countered. And the trading post has been established as an extension of neutral territory for purposes of commerce. Colonel Prescott confirmed this arrangement himself. Colonel Prescott is no longer in command, Wade reminded her coldly. And Major Wilson takes a different view of such accommodations. He gestured to his men. Search the property, thoroughly. Sarah's heart pounded as the soldiers spread out, entering the cabin, the barn, checking the small outbuildings. She maintained her composure, continuing to hang laundry, as if unconcerned by their intrusion. Mrs. Thornwood, Wade said, his voice softening slightly as he approached her, I understand your attachment to Blackwood. Many women in isolated situations develop misplaced loyalties, but you must understand, the man is dangerous, a traitor to the army and mistrusted by his own people. My relationship with Mr. Blackwood is professional, Sarah replied stiffly. He works my land in exchange for securing his freedom, an arrangement your superior approved. An arrangement being reconsidered in light of new evidence, Wade countered. Harris and his men reported seeing Blackwood meeting with a known hostile just beyond your property line 3 days ago. Sarah's blood ran cold. Grey Wolf had indeed brought a message recently, but they had been careful to meet at the trading post, not on the homestead. Either Harris was lying or they had been watched more closely than they realized. That's simply untrue, she said firmly. Mr. Blackwood hasn't violated any terms of his release. One by one, the soldiers returned, reporting no sign of Matthew in any of the buildings. Wade's frustration was evident as he issued new orders. Clemens, Taylor, ride to the trading post. If Blackwood is there, arrest him immediately. The rest, Of you, search the perimeter of the property. His gaze returned to Sarah. We'll wait. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Wade and 2 soldiers remained at the cabin while the others searched. Sarah continued her domestic tasks, acutely aware of Matthew hidden below their feet in the cramped root cellar. If the soldiers thought, to check for hidden storage areas. As the sun began to set, the search parties returned, with no sign of Matthew at the trading post or anywhere on the property. Wade's suspicion had clearly deepened. He's fled, the lieutenant concluded. Likely, warned by his Lakota contacts of our approach. Or perhaps he's simply at the trading post, as I said, and your men missed him, Sarah suggested mildly. Wade's patience had clearly reached its limit. Mrs. Thornwood, harboring a deserter is a serious offense, as is interfering with the military. Investigation. If you know where Blackwood is. The lieutenant's threat was interrupted by a commotion from the ridge to the west, the thundering of hooves and the high, ululating cries that raised the hair on Sarah's neck. "Lakota!" one of the soldiers shouted, raising his rifle. Sarah turned to see a band of mounted warriors cresting the ridge, at least 20 riders, weapons raised, painted for war. At their head rode a tall figure she recognized instantly from the confrontation months earlier, Running Elk, Matthew's cousin. "Inside, ma'am," Wade ordered, drawing his revolver. "Men, defensive positions." But Sarah remained on the porch, watching as the war party halted just beyond the boundary cairns marking her property. Running Elk raised his hand, and his warriors grew still, their horses pawing restlessly at the ground. "They're respecting the boundary," Sarah observed, relief mingling with confusion. "Standing Bear's agreement still holds." "For now," Wade said grimly, "but they're sending a message. We're surrounded." Indeed, the Lakota had positioned themselves in a wide semicircle along the western edge of the property, not advancing, but clearly not leaving either. "Lieutenant," Sarah said quietly, "I suggest you and your men depart while you can. Their quarrel isn't with you, but your presence here could provoke them." "We don't run from hostiles," Wade replied stiffly. "Then you risk turning my homestead into a battlefield," Sarah countered. "Is that your intention?" Before Wade could respond, another rider appeared on the ridge, alone, approaching slowly with a raised hand. Grey Wolf. The Lakota warrior stopped at the boundary cairn, calling out in clear English, "The woman who wears my sister's mark must come. Standing Bear sends for her." Wade moved to block Sarah's path. "This is clearly a trap, Mrs. Thornwood. I forbid you to—" "You have no authority to forbid me anything on my own land, Lieutenant," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I will speak with Grey Wolf. I cannot allow—" "You have 2 choices," Sarah said firmly. "Leave my property with your men, or stay and watch me cross that boundary to speak with the Lakota. Which would you prefer to explain to Major Wilson?" Wade's face flushed with anger, but he recognized the impossible position. If he left, he abandoned his search for Matthew. If he stayed, he might witness, even tacitly allow, Sarah's collusion with the enemy. "Sergeant," he ordered finally, "remain here with 2 men. Continue searching for Blackwood. The rest come with me to bring reinforcements." His gaze returned to Sarah. "This isn't over, Mrs. Thornwood." "No," she agreed softly. "I suspect it's just beginning." After Wade departed with half his men, Sarah approached the boundary cairn where Grey Wolf waited. The remaining soldiers watched nervously, rifles ready but not aimed. "Grey Wolf," she greeted him. "Why has Standing Bear sent—" "For me, war comes," the warrior replied simply. "My father offers sanctuary to the woman who saved Black Crow, and to Black Crow himself." Sarah glanced back at her cabin, her home, the place she had fought so hard to preserve as neutral ground. "You know I cannot abandon this place." "You will die if you stay," Grey Wolf said bluntly. "The Bluecoats suspect you. The miners want your land. My cousin—" He nodded toward Running Elk. Respects my father's wishes for now, but his patience ends. And what of Black Crow? Sarah asked carefully, aware of the soldiers listening. What sanctuary does Standing Bear offer him? Grey Wolf's expression softened slightly. The man who walks between worlds has chosen his path. My father would welcome him as a son returned. The implication was clear. Matthew could find acceptance among the Lakota again, could rejoin his mother's people despite his time with the army. It was an extraordinary offer, one that spoke to Standing Bear's deep respect. I must think on this, Sarah said finally, and speak with those concerned. Grey Wolf nodded. Until tomorrow's sunrise, the offer stands. After that, we join Sitting Bull to fight the Bluecoats. He lowered his voice. Choose wisely, brave woman. Some battles cannot be won, only survived. As Grey Wolf rode back to the waiting warriors, Sarah returned to the cabin, mind racing. The sergeant and his men watched her suspiciously, but said nothing as she entered her home. Inside, with the door closed, Sarah hurried to the root cellar, opening the hidden compartment where Matthew had been concealed for hours. I heard, he said as he emerged, stretching his cramped limbs. Grey Wolf's offer. You heard everything? Enough. Matthew's expression was troubled. Wade won't give up. He'll return with more men, and next time, they'll find me. Then we have until dawn to decide, Sarah said. Stay and fight a losing battle to maintain neutral ground, or accept Standing Bear's offer of sanctuary. Matthew took her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses earned from months of frontier labor. Sarah, there's a third option. Take Harris's money, return east to your sister to safety. This was never your fight. It became my fight the moment I opened my door to you, Sarah replied, and I won't abandon you now, even if staying means losing everything. Sarah looked around the cabin, at the home she had created, the life she had built from the remnants of Thomas's dream. Then her gaze returned to Matthew's face, to the man who had transformed her understanding of courage, of justice, of standing one's ground when easier paths beckoned. Perhaps we lose the homestead, she acknowledged. But we wouldn't lose everything. Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. After months of careful distance, of unspoken feelings, the truth emerged in the face of their impossible choice. Sarah, he began, his voice husky with emotion. I never dared hope. Nor did I, she admitted. But here we are, between two fires, and suddenly the way forward seems clear. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative despite the urgency of their situation. Their second left no doubt about feelings too long contained. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. If we accept Standing Bear's offer, there's no going back. Not to this life. I know, Sarah whispered. But perhaps we build a new one, not as a settler and a scout, but as two people who chose compassion over hatred, humanity over blind allegiance. Outside, the sergeant called for his men to maintain vigilance as darkness fell. On the ridge, the Lakota warriors kindled small fires, settling in to wait for dawn and the decision that would come with it. Inside the cabin, Sarah and Matthew began gathering the few precious items they would take with them. Mementos of the life they were leaving behind, seeds for the one they hoped to build. Whatever came next, war or peace, acceptance or continued struggle, they would face it, as they had faced everything since that snowy night when fate brought them together. Together, between two worlds, but belonging fully to each other. In the first light of dawn, when the sergeant and his men burst into the empty cabin, they found only a letter addressed to Lieutenant Wade. In it, Sarah relinquished her claim to the homestead, declaring it true neutral ground to be used as a meeting place between the army and the Lakota should peace negotiations ever become possible. By then, Sarah and Matthew were miles away, riding with Grey Wolf towards Standing Bear's camp. Behind them, the rising sun illuminated the cabin one last time, a brief, brave experiment in neutrality overtaken by the gathering storm of war. But as Sarah rode beside the man she had once saved, and who had in turn saved her, she felt not defeat, but possibility. The frontier had taught her that endings were often beginnings in disguise, that loss could reveal what truly mattered, and that sometimes the bravest choice was to surrender not to others, but to one's own heart. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.